It was meant to be the final act of justice, the symbolic close to history's darkest chapter. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, inside a converted gymnasium in Nuremberg Prison, 10 of Hitler's most powerful lieutenants stood before the gallows. They had been judged, convicted, and sentenced by an international tribunal aiming to restore a shattered world's sense of law and morality. But what followed wasn't solemn closure, it was chaos. Screams echoed, bodies convulsed. Some men took over 20 minutes to die. The executions, carried out by the victorious Allies, were botched in ways that shocked both witnesses and the world. How could something so meticulously prepared go so grotesquely wrong? Was it simple incompetence or something darker? The Nuremberg Trials aimed to uphold civilization. Yet in their final moments, the line between justice and vengeance began to blur. This is the story of how the world's most famous executions went so badly. The Nuremberg Executions marked the grim conclusion of the first international war crimes tribunal in modern history. After months of proceedings, 12 senior Nazi leaders were sentenced to death for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggressive war. 2 escaped the noose: Hermann Göring by suicide the night before his execution, and Martin Bormann, sentenced in absentia. The remaining 10, including Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, and Julius Streicher, were hanged on October 16, 1946. The setting was improvised, a gymnasium inside Nuremberg Prison converted into a stark execution chamber with 2 wooden gallows.
The hangings were to be carried out by the U.S. Army using the standard drop method, a technique designed to cause death by strangulation rather than neck break, supposedly ensuring a slow but legal death. Everything was meant to be precise: times, procedures, and records. The Allies wanted the world to witness a new kind of justice, calculated, deliberate, and free from the chaos of wartime revenge. Yet despite this ambition, the practical details of the execution were haphazard at best. The setting was ill-suited, the equipment jury-rigged, and the man chosen to carry out the sentences was far from the professional many assumed he was. At the center of the Nuremberg executions stood Master Sergeant John C. Woods, a man who had hanged dozens of Nazi war criminals in the U.S. Army's post-war purges, yet whose credentials as a hangman were murky at best. Woods claimed to have learned execution techniques on the job, and his only formal qualification was a background as an electrician. His past included a questionable discharge from the U.S. Navy for mental instability and reports of botched executions during his time in military service. Despite these red flags, Woods was chosen to carry out the most symbolic executions of the 20th century. He exuded a strange pride in his grim work, reportedly saying afterward, "10 men in 103 minutes, that's not bad." But his bravado masked a troubling level of incompetence. Woods ignored established protocols used by British and American executioners for calculating drop lengths based on weight, ensuring the neck snapped instantly. Instead, he used a one-size-fits-all standard drop, which frequently resulted in strangulation rather than swift death. The choice of Woods remains baffling to historians. In a moment when the world demanded precision and dignity, the Allies turned over their greatest act of legal vengeance to a man whose track record foreshadowed disaster. The Nuremberg executions were plagued not just by poor oversight, but by fundamental mechanical failures that turned what should have been quick, controlled hangings into drawn-out horrors. The method used, the standard drop, was developed in the 19th century but had long been considered outdated. Unlike the long drop, which requires precise calculations based on the prisoner's weight and body type to break the neck instantly, the standard drop used a fixed-length fall, often resulting in slow strangulation. Woods ignored drop tables used by professional executioners. No adjustments were made for the physical differences among the condemned. Some were too light for the drop to break their necks. Others were so heavy that they nearly hit the floor. In several cases, the prisoners' heads struck the wooden trapdoor frame or gallows as they fell, causing bleeding or bruising before death even occurred. Eyewitnesses reported that multiple prisoners didn't die instantly. Ribbentrop, for example, reportedly convulsed for up to 20 minutes before dying.
Julius Streicher's body thrashed violently, and he was heard crying out in pain. In some cases, Woods had to climb the scaffold and tug on the legs of the dying men to speed up death. The gallows themselves were part of the problem. Constructed hastily, they had small trapdoors, narrow beams, and little clearance beneath. The entire structure was poorly suited for precise execution. Rather than demonstrating the dignity of justice, the scene descended into a grotesque spectacle. These physical failures weren't just unfortunate, they represented a profound breakdown in the very justice the Allies hoped to symbolize. What should have been solemn and orderly became grim and chaotic, casting a long shadow over what should have been a moment of moral clarity. The clearest evidence of how badly the Nuremberg executions went comes from the people who were there: reporters, prison staff, and Allied officials who bore witness to the grim proceedings. Their accounts paint a disturbing picture, one that sharply contrasts with the precision and justice the trials were meant to represent. Kingsbury Smith, a journalist present for the executions, described several disturbing details in his report. Julius Streicher's hanging was particularly grotesque. After screaming Heil Hitler before the drop, he fell awkwardly and began convulsing violently. Smith reported that Streicher appeared to be strangling rather than dying instantly, his face contorting in pain as he twisted on the rope. Joachim von Ribbentrop reportedly suffered a similar fate. His execution was delayed as guards struggled with the bindings, and after the drop, he dangled and convulsed for nearly 20 minutes. The rope had not broken his neck. He died slowly by asphyxiation. Other witnesses recalled seeing the condemned men's heads hit the trapdoor or gallows beams during the fall, causing visible injuries. Some executions had to be repeated due to mechanical errors. In more than one case, Sergeant Woods reportedly had to pull on the legs of the dying men to hasten death, an image that horrified observers. Even Time magazine, in its coverage of the event, noted that the executions were far from smooth. The bodies of the executed were said to be bruised, bloodied, and mishandled. What was intended to be the final, dignified act of justice had devolved into something closer to a public shaming, clumsy, cruel, and unforgettable. These eyewitness accounts transformed the Nuremberg executions from a moment of moral closure into a moment of historical embarrassment. The botched nature of the Nuremberg executions has led some to question whether incompetence alone was to blame. Could the prolonged, brutal deaths have been intentional, an unofficial form of retribution disguised as legal punishment? One of the most persistent rumors is that John C. Woods, the executioner, deliberately used faulty methods to ensure the condemned Nazis suffered. His refusal to use the long drop technique, standard among professional hangmen, despite its availability and proven efficacy, raised eyebrows. Some noted his near-mocking attitude toward the prisoners and his post-execution bragging, "I hanged those 10 Nazis. And I'm proud of it." To some, that sounded more like vengeance than duty. Historians remain divided. While there's no direct evidence of a conspiracy to torture the Nazis on the gallows, the deliberate failure to adhere to established standards invites suspicion. Was Woods simply unqualified and reckless, or was he executing justice in a form he believed was morally justified? The Nuremberg trials were meant to rise above the horrors of the war, to show that even the worst criminals deserved a fair, dignified sentence. But the line between justice and vengeance is thin, and on that October morning, many believe it was crossed. The mishandled Nuremberg executions left a blemish on what was otherwise a landmark achievement in international justice. While the trials themselves set a powerful precedent, holding leaders accountable for crimes against humanity, the executions threatened to undermine that legacy. Instead of reinforcing the rule of law, they gave critics grounds to argue that the Allies had not fully risen above the brutality they had condemned. For decades, historians, legal scholars, and ethicists have debated the impact of those final moments. The gruesome deaths of men like Ribbentrop and Streicher didn't make the world feel more just, they made the spectacle of justice feel disturbingly close to revenge. In a court built on the principle of fairness, the final act seemed anything but. John C. Woods died in an unrelated accident in 1950, never held accountable or even seriously questioned about his role. The Nuremberg gallows were dismantled, the bodies cremated, and the ashes scattered in secret. Yet the memory of that morning lingers, a haunting epilogue to a trial that promised moral clarity. The executions didn't undo the significance of Nuremberg, but they complicated it. They serve as a cautionary tale that even in the pursuit of justice, how we carry out punishment matters just as much as why. In our rush to punish evil, have we risked becoming unjust ourselves? The Nuremberg executions were meant to symbolize the triumph of justice over tyranny, a final, righteous chapter to the horrors of World War II. Instead, they expose the fragility of that justice when marred by haste, poor planning, or perhaps hidden malice. The hangings did not offer the clean moral closure many had hoped for. Instead, they left behind a grim question mark, hanging alongside the ropes. If we judge evil by how far it strays from humanity, then what does it say when our response, however justified, begins to look the same? When justice falters, who truly stands vindicated?